What happens when a billionaire publicly humiliates his ex-wife at the most prestigious gala of the year? Richard Beaumont, a titan of industry, thought he had it all. Standing on a pedestal of wealth and arrogance, he pointed at his former wife, Catherine, and let out a booming laugh for all to hear, mocking her fall from grace. He thought she was a forgotten chapter, a nobody, but he made one critical mistake. He forgot who he was dealing with. In the next 60 seconds, the entire world would watch as the sound of rotor blades silenced the crowd, and all cameras turned towards the sky, capturing an arrival that would not just shatter Richard's ego, but threaten to bring his entire empire crumbling to the ground. The divorce wasn't a battle, it was a demolition. Richard Beaumont, with the full might of Beaumont Industries and the legal prowess of Sullivan and Cromwell Elp behind him, had systematically dismantled Catherine Davenport's life. In the sterile mahogany-paneled conference room high above Park Avenue, she hadn't stood a chance. Richard's lead counsel, a shark named Arthur Kendrick, had laid out the terms with a chillingly polite smile. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad, he'd explained, as if speaking to a child. Catherine would receive a one-time settlement, a sum that sounded vast to the average person, but was in Richard's world less than the depreciation on his private jet in a single year. She would forfeit any claim to their properties, their art collection, and most cruelly, any stake in the company she had quietly helped shape. "You were a decorator," Catherine Richard had said, his voice laced with a casual cruelty that was far more painful than outright rage. He adjusted his Brioni tie, a picture of unassailable power. "You picked out curtains and planned parties. Let's not pretend you were ever a partner in any meaningful sense." Catherine remembered gripping the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. She had wanted to scream. She had wanted to list every late night she'd spent combing through financial reports. He'd been too bored to read every strategic insight she'd offered over dinner that he'd later presented as his own in the boardroom. Every social event she had masterfully orchestrated to woo a difficult investor or smooth over one of his public gaffes. She had been his silent strategist, his social architect, his emotional ballast. He had seen her as furniture. The final decree felt like a final nail. The press, fed a steady diet of curated leaks from Richard's PR team, painted a predictable picture. The beautiful but vapid socialite attempting to fleece her brilliant, long-suffering husband. The headlines in the New York Post were brutal. Catherine stopped leaving her apartment, the palatial Fifth Avenue penthouse that was no longer hers. The silence in the vast space was deafening, broken only by the hum of the climate control and the distant symphony of city traffic. Her last day in the penthouse was a study in humiliation. Richard had sent his new girlfriend, a lingerie model named Lauren, to supervise Catherine's packing. Lauren, all of 24 and radiating an effortless condescension, trailed her through the rooms, pointing at items with a manicured finger. "Richard said you could take the Wedgwood plates," Lauren chirped, examining her reflection in a gilded mirror. "The ones from his grandmother. It's a very generous gesture." Catherine looked at the plates, each one a memory of a tense family holiday she had navigated with painstaking diplomacy. They felt tainted. She packed only her clothes, her books, and a small, unassuming painting of a windswept coastline she had bought with her own money years before she'd met Richard. As she walked out of the service elevator for the last time, the doorman, a kind man named Patrick, who had always shared a friendly word, avoided her gaze. In Richard Beaumont's world, irrelevance was a communicable disease. She moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village, paid for with the first installment of her settlement. The change was jarring. The grandeur of Fifth Avenue was replaced by the rumble of the subway and the chatter of students from nearby NYU. For the first month, she did almost nothing. She existed in a grey fog of shock and grief, not just for her marriage, but for the years she had invested in a man who had valued her at nothing. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday. She was trying to make sense of her finances, the settlement that was meant to last a lifetime, but felt terrifyingly finite. She spread the papers across her small dining table the same way she used to do with Richard's business files. And then she saw it. A footnote in a prospectus for a venture capital fund she'd once researched for him. It mentioned a burgeoning field, predictive data analytics for renewable energy grids. It was a sector deemed too niche, too volatile by major players like Beaumont Industries, who were still heavily invested in traditional energy. Richard had scoffed at it. Green energy is a charity project, Catherine, not a business. But looking at the data, the projected growth, the increasing government subsidies, Catherine saw something else. She saw a blind spot. Richard's blind spot. He was a titan, yes, but a titan from a dying era, too arrogant to see the shift coming. A tiny spark ignited within the fog. It was an idea fragile, but persistent. She spent the next week devouring everything she could find on the topic. She called professors, read white papers, and built financial models on a cheap laptop. The woman Richard had dismissed as a decorator was in secret a formidable researcher with an intuitive grasp of market dynamics. She had one last card to play, one connection Richard had never bothered to cultivate. Henry Wallace, a legendary semi-retired venture capitalist. Henry had been a friend of her father's. Richard had always found him dull, a relic from a bygone era of handshake deals and long-term vision. He had dismissed him as past his prime. Catherine knew better. Henry Wallace didn't invest in companies. He invested in people. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone. She had no company, no staff, and a business plan sketched out on legal pads. But she had an idea, and for the first time in a very long time, she had a flicker of hope. She was no longer Mrs. Beaumont. She was Catherine Davenport, and she was about to start building. The first meeting with Henry Wallace took place in a dusty book-lined office in a pre-war building overlooking Gramercy Park. The contrast with Richard's sleek, minimalist corporate headquarters was stark. Henry's office was a place of substance, not style. It smelled of old paper leather and pipe tobacco. Henry, a man in his late 70s, with eyes that had lost none of their sharpness, listened without interruption for nearly 2 hours. He leaned back in his worn leather chair, fingertips steepled as Catherine laid out her vision. She wasn't just talking about solar panels or wind turbines. She was talking about the brain behind them. She spoke of AI-driven software that could predict energy consumption spikes, reroute power from surplus grids to deficit areas in real time, and optimize battery storage to eliminate waste. She called her nascent company Nexus Solutions. Beaumont Industries and others like it, they see energy as a commodity to be extracted and sold. Catherine explained, her voice gaining confidence with every word. They are playing checkers. I want to play chess. The future isn't in generating power, it's in managing it intelligently. That's where the real value, the real revolution lies. She handed him a meticulously prepared folder containing market analysis, 5-year projections, and a lean, scalable business model. He took his time, turning each page slowly, his expression unreadable. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at her, a long, appraising stare. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. Richard is a fool, Henry said, his voice a low rumble. He always was. He inherited an empire and thinks he built it. He can't tell the difference between a balance sheet and a vision. He tapped the folder. This is a vision. He opened a drawer in his heavy oak desk and took out a checkbook. I'll provide the seed funding, not as a loan, but for a 20% stake. I'm not a banker, Catherine. I'm a partner. Tears pricked Catherine's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. This was not a moment for weakness. It was a moment of validation. Thank you, Henry. She managed, her voice thick with emotion. Don't thank me. He grunted, scribbling on the check. Make me money, and more importantly, prove that arrogant son of a bitch wrong. The next 2 years were a blur of relentless work. Catherine moved out of her Greenwich Village apartment and into a smaller, cheaper one in Astoria, Queens, pouring every cent of her settlement, and Henry's investment into Nexus Solutions. Her first office was a shared workspace above a bakery where the smell of yeast and sugar mingled with the electric hum of servers. She hired a small, brilliant team of young engineers and data scientists, convincing them to take a chance on her vision, with a combination of passion and stock options. She was the first one in every morning and the last one out, often sleeping on a couch in the office. She learned to code, she negotiated with hardware suppliers, and she pitched to early adopter clients, municipal governments, and environmentally conscious corporations that Richard's company had long ignored. She was no longer the woman who planned parties. She was a CEO running on caffeine and conviction. Her big break came when she secured a pilot program with the city of Portland, Oregon. Nexus Solutions software was implemented across a section of their grid, and the results were staggering. Within 6 months, they had reduced energy waste by 18% and prevented 3 major blackouts during a summer heatwave. The case study went viral within the industry. Suddenly, Catherine Davenport was no longer a ghost. She was a name whispered in tech circles. Nexus Solutions began attracting attention and, more importantly, clients. A second round of funding, led by a prestigious Silicon Valley firm, valued her company at a figure that made her initial settlement from Richard look like pocket change. She moved Nexus Solutions into a proper office in the Flatiron district, a space filled with light plants and the vibrant energy of a company on the rise. She still worked punishing hours, but now there was a sense of momentum, of inevitability. She allowed herself small luxuries, like buying a new suit from the Row, not because it was a status symbol, but because it felt like armor. She rarely thought of Richard, except as a distant data point, a symbol of the old guard she was working to supplant. She never read the society pages anymore and had no idea what he was up to. Her world was no longer defined by his. It was defined by gigawatts data streams and the quiet satisfaction of building something real, something that mattered. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving completely off the radar of the world she had once inhabited. And that was exactly how she liked it. While Catherine was building her empire, in the light, Richard Beaumont was struggling to keep his from crumbling in the shadows. On the surface, nothing had changed. He was still a fixture at all the right restaurants, his pronouncements on the market were still quoted by Bloomberg, and Lauren was still a decorative accessory on his arm. But inside the glass and steel fortress of Beaumont Industries, the foundations were cracking. The source of the rot was a disastrous acquisition made 3 years prior. Richard, driven by ego, had overpaid for a legacy oil company in Texas, convinced he could squeeze out efficiencies and ride one last wave of fossil fuel profits. He had ignored the warnings of his own analysts, who pointed to shifting political winds and the unstoppable rise of renewables. The deal was a dud. The oil fields were less productive than promised, and new environmental regulations had turned the asset into a billion-dollar liability. Beaumont Industries was bleeding cash. The stock, once a blue-chip stalwart, was stagnating. The board was growing restless. Richard, for the first time in his life, felt the cold prickle of fear. He projected an aura of unshakable confidence, but his nights were sleepless, filled with the gnawing anxiety of failure. His lifeline, his one big play to reverse the tide, was Oratech. It was a small, privately held robotics and AI logistics company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Oratech wasn't glamorous, but their proprietary software was revolutionary. It could automate entire supply chains from warehouse to delivery with terrifying efficiency. For Beaumont Industries, which spent a fortune on logistics for its myriad divisions, acquiring Oratech would slash costs by billions instantly, boosting their bottom line and dazzling Wall Street. It would be the masterstroke that secured his legacy. He'd been in aggressive private negotiations to buy the company for months. The founder, an eccentric MIT professor, was notoriously difficult, but Richard was confident his money could solve any problem. He saw it as a done deal. One afternoon, Henry Wallace called Catherine. His voice was calm, but she could detect an underlying urgency. "I'm hearing things, Catherine," he said. "Richard Beaumont is in trouble, deeper than anyone knows. He staked his entire reputation on acquiring a company called Auratech." Catherine felt a jolt. Auratech, the AI logistics firm? The very one. Their automation software is the best in the world. I know you've been looking at ways to streamline the hardware deployment side of Nexus. You should take a look at them. I have, Catherine admitted. We did a deep dive a few months ago. Their tech is brilliant. It could cut our installation and maintenance overhead by 40%. But they weren't for sale. The founder is particular. "Everyone has a price," Henry said, "and desperate men like Richard tend to make a lot of noise. He's been trying to bully them into a sale. It's not working. The founder doesn't like him. Perhaps he'd prefer a different kind of buyer, someone with a vision for the future, not someone trying to patch up the past." The implication hung in the air. This wasn't just about synergy or business strategy anymore. This was a crossroads. Auratech was the key to Richard's survival. It was also the key to catapulting Nexus Solutions into the next stratosphere. The two paths, which had diverged so completely, were about to collide. Catherine spent the next week in a whirlwind of secret activity. She flew to Boston on a private charter, a necessity she now saw as a business tool, not an indulgence. She didn't meet the Auratech founder in a boardroom. Instead, respecting his known eccentricities, she met him at the MIT Museum, surrounded by the history of innovation. His name was Dr. Aris Thorne, a man with a wild mane of white hair and a mind that moved at the speed of light. He had been stonewalling Richard for months, disgusted by his corporate raiding tactics. Catherine didn't talk about share prices or cost-cutting. She talked about the future. She showed him how his logistics AI could be integrated with her energy management AI to create truly smart, sustainable cities. She painted a picture of a world where his technology wasn't just making a dinosaur of a company more efficient, but was actively building a better, cleaner world. "Mr. Beaumont wants to use my life's work to make his shipping manifests cheaper," Dr. Thorne said, his eyes twinkling. "You want to use it to build the future." He didn't agree on the spot, but when Catherine flew back to New York, she knew she had planted a seed in fertile ground. Over the next few days, her lawyers, working in concert with Henry's team, drafted an offer. It was audacious, structured, with a mix of cash and a significant stake in the combined future entity of Nexus Aura. It was a partnership, not a conquest. The offer was sent. For 72 hours, there was silence. Catherine felt a tension she hadn't experienced since the early days of Nexus. On the third day, as she was reviewing schematics for a new project, an encrypted email arrived. It was from Dr. Thorne's legal team. They had accepted her offer. The deal was done. Nexus Solutions, the company, born from the ashes of her divorce, had just acquired the one asset Richard Beaumont needed to save himself. And no one, least of all Richard, knew a thing. The contracts were signed under a strict non-disclosure agreement, with the official announcement to be made in 1 week's time at the annual Metropolitan Innovators Gala, where the keynote speaker was, until now, a closely guarded secret. The Metropolitan Innovators Gala was the glittering apex of the New York business and tech calendar. It was a night of self-congratulation, of hushed deals made over champagne, and of a carefully calibrated social hierarchy on full display. Richard Beaumont was in his element. He stood near the center of the vast starlit ballroom at the Museum of Modern Art, a glass of vintage Dom Perignon in his hand, Lauren clinging to his arm like a designer handbag. He was holding court, his voice booming over the polite murmur of the crowd. He felt invincible tonight. The final papers for the Auratech acquisition were, he believed, being drawn up. His lawyers had assured him the reclusive founder was just playing hard to get, that their latest overwhelming cash offer would be irresistible. Tonight was a victory lap. He was Richard Beaumont, and he always won. Then across the room, he saw her, Catherine. He hadn't seen her in person in almost 3 years. She looked different. The expensive, sometimes frivolous fashion of her past life was gone, replaced by a simple, exquisitely cut black gown by Narciso Rodriguez. It was severe, elegant, and utterly commanding. She wasn't dripping in diamonds. Her only jewelry was a pair of subtle platinum earrings. She looked formidable. A flicker of something unpleasant, an emotion he couldn't name went through him. She was speaking with Henry Wallace, the old relic. Richard scoffed internally. Of course. The washed-up investor and the washed-up wife. A perfect pair. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp British accent. Mr. Beaumont, Olivia Munro, Financial Times. And Richard turned his public smile, snapping into place. Olivia Munro was a piranha, a reporter, known for her incisive, often brutal, business reporting. Ms. Munro, he said smoothly, enjoying the party? Immensely, she replied, her eyes sharp. I was hoping for a comment on the rumours swirling around Beaumont Industries, the whispers of a liquidity crisis, and your rather aggressive, some might say, desperate pursuit of Oratech. Richard's smile tightened. The directness of the question in this public forum was a clear attack. He could feel the ears of those around him perking up. He needed to deflect, to reassert his dominance. And then his eyes fell on Catherine again. She was the perfect scapegoat, an easy target to re-establish his own superiority. He let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a performance, and he threw his head back to make sure everyone saw it. Desperate, he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. He deliberately raised his arm and pointed directly at Catherine across the room. 100 heads turned to follow his gesture. You're asking me about desperation. Catherine, who had been deep in conversation, looked up, her expression turning from confusion to disbelief as she saw she was the center of a sudden, unwelcome spotlight. Richard's voice carried across the ballroom. If you want to know about financial trouble, you should be asking her for advice. Last I heard, she was decorating shoebox apartments in Queens. Maybe she can give you tips on how to stretch a budget. A wave of uncomfortable laughter and shocked murmurs rippled through this elite crowd. It was a stunningly cruel public humiliation. Lauren giggled beside him, squeezing his arm. Richard felt a surge of triumph. He had turned the tables, belittled the reporter, and put his ex-wife in her place all in one stroke. He was the king of this jungle. Catherine stood frozen for a moment, the blood draining from her face. The stares of hundreds of people felt like physical blows. She could see the pity, the morbid curiosity, the faint smirks. She saw Richard, puffed up with arrogance, soaking in his petty victory. For a split second, the old, powerless Catherine threatened to surface. But then something else took over. A cold, quiet calm. She simply held his gaze from across the room, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say a word. She just had to wait. It was at that exact moment that a new sound began to permeate the ballroom. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping, barely perceptible over the string quartet. But it grew steadily louder, a deep, percussive whump, whump, whump that vibrated through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the museum's sculpture garden. The conversations faltered. Heads turned from Catherine, tilting upwards towards the source of the sound. It was the unmistakable sound of a helicopter not passing over, but descending and descending fast, somewhere very close by. All eyes, including a bewildered Richard's, swiveled to the windows. The flashing navigation lights of a sleek black Sikorsky S-76 sliced through the night sky as it prepared to land on the helipad of the skyscraper adjacent to the museum. The string quartet trailed off into an awkward silence, completely drowned out. The entire gala, the titans of finance, the tech gurus, the society mavens, was now captivated by this unscheduled arrival. The cameras of the press, which had just been trained on Richard's mocking face, now turned as one, pointing their long lenses towards the drama unfolding outside. Richard stared confused. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. On the stage at the far end of the ballroom, the night's master of ceremonies, a well-known news anchor, hurried to the podium, a frantic-looking assistant, whispering in his ear. He tapped the microphone, his professional composure visibly rattled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice straining to be heard over the now idling rotor wash. We, um, we have a slight change to our program. It appears our keynote speaker, the anonymous benefactor of tonight's gala, has just arrived." A wave of excited murmurs swept the room. The identity of the benefactor had been the biggest mystery of the night. Richard felt a pang of annoyance. Who had the gall to upstage his moment? Then the MC continued, his voice filled with a newfound awe. "It is my profound honor to be the first to publicly announce two monumental pieces of news. First, the acquisition of Auratech has just been finalized. And second, please join me in welcoming the architect of that deal, the visionary founder and CEO of Nexus Solutions, Ms. Catherine Davenport." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Time seemed to slow down. Richard Beaumont's smug, triumphant expression collapsed as if it were a building imploding in on itself. His face cycled through a rapid series of emotions: confusion, denial, dawning comprehension, and finally a mask of ashen horror. The Dom Perignon glass slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the polished floor, the sound lost in the stunned silence. Lauren looked from Richard's pale face to the stage, her mouth agape. "Catherine, you're Catherine," she whispered, the pieces not quite fitting together in her mind. All eyes which had been on the helicopter now snapped back to the woman in the simple black dress. Catherine Davenport, the woman Richard had just publicly ridiculed as a failure, was the mystery benefactor, the keynote speaker, the new owner of the very company he had staked his future on. It was a plot twist so audacious, so theatrical, it felt ripped from a Hollywood script. As if on cue, a side door near the stage opened. Catherine, who had slipped out of the main room unnoticed during the commotion, reappeared. She had not arrived in the helicopter. That was pure stagecraft, a power move orchestrated by Henry to perfection. She had been there all along, waiting. She walked towards the stage with a steady, unhurried grace, her heels clicking with quiet authority on the marble floor. The sea of billionaires and power brokers parted for her as if she were royalty. The camera flashes were blinding, a strobing, frantic volley of light that followed her every step. The reporters, led by a voraciously scribbling Olivia Monroe, scrambled for a better position. This wasn't just a business story anymore. It was the stuff of legend. Catherine ascended the small set of stairs to the stage. She shook the MC's hand and gave a small, polite nod to the stunned audience. She adjusted the microphone, her movements calm and deliberate. She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze sweeping over them, before landing just for a moment on Richard. He looked small, shrunken. A man drowning in the wreckage of his own arrogance. She offered no smirk, no sign of triumph. Her expression was one of serene, implacable pshul. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the cavernous space. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. My partner, Henry Wallace, has a flair for the theatrical." A small, knowing laugh rippled through the audience as they glanced at the beaming Henry. "Some of you may remember me from a different life," she continued, her tone even. "A life of galas, much like this one, though my role was somewhat different then. But I'm not here tonight to talk about the past. I am here to talk about the future." She didn't mention Richard. She didn't need to. Every single person in that room was filling in the blanks. Her speech was a masterclass in substance over spectacle, though the spectacle of her presence was overwhelming. She spoke with passion and precision about the synergy between Nexus Solutions and Auratech. She laid out a vision for an integrated future of smart grids powered by sustainable energy and managed by an intelligent logistics network that eliminated waste at every level. For too long, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, the titans of industry have focused on extraction, extracting resources from the earth and extracting value for shareholders. They have operated from a mindset of scarcity and zero-sum games. But the future is not about extraction. It's about creation. It's about integration. It's about building systems that are not just profitable, but sustainable and intelligent. That is the mission of the new combined entity of Nexus and Aura. Richard stood paralyzed, the shattered glass at his feet, a perfect metaphor for his world. Every word Catherine spoke was a nail in his coffin. She hadn't just bought the company he needed. She had articulated a vision for the future that made him and his entire business model sound like a fossil. He was the past. She was undeniably the future. The board members of Beaumont Industries who were present in the room were studiously avoiding his gaze, their faces grim. They were already calculating the fallout. When Catherine finished her speech, the room, after a beat of stunned silence, erupted in thunderous applause. It was genuine, effusive, and long. It was the sound of a new queen being crowned. She gave a final, gracious nod and walked off the stage, not back towards the crowd, but towards the side exit, where Henry was waiting for her. Her work here was done. As she passed, she was intercepted by Olivia Munro, the reporter's eyes shining with professional zeal. Ms. Davenport, an incredible coup. Do you have any comment for Mr. Beaumont, who so publicly mocked you just moments before your announcement? Catherine paused. She looked past the reporter, her gaze sweeping over the chaotic room until it found Richard one last time. He looked utterly broken. She then turned back to Olivia, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. No comment, she said, her voice soft but firm. Mr. Beaumont has made his position quite clear, and tonight I've made mine. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the world to digest the story of the woman who had been laughed out of the room only to return and buy the building. The dawn that broke over New York City was mercilessly clear. For Richard Beaumont, it illuminated the wreckage of his life with crystalline precision. He woke on a silk sofa in his cavernous living room, the memory of the gala a toxic sludge in his mind. The penthouse was silent. Lauren was gone. On the marble kitchen island, a single sheet of her personalized stationery was left next to her discarded engagement ring. The note was short and brutal. I can't be associated with this. Don't call me. He stumbled towards his phone, dreading what he would find. The screen flared to life with a digital scream, 312 missed calls, over 1,000 notifications. At the top of the feed was Olivia Munro's article for the Financial Times. The headline, already syndicated across the globe, was a dagger, the gala, the helicopter, and the humiliation. How Catherine Davenport redefined corporate revenge. Below it, a split-screen photo on the left. Richard, his face a mask of arrogant mockery as he pointed across the room. On the right, Catherine on the stage, poised and powerful. He looked like a bully, a fool. She looked like a queen. His thumb trembled as he opened his stock app. In pre-market trading, Beaumont Industries, BEA, was in a catastrophic vertical dive, down 42%. Billions in market capitalization had evaporated overnight, based on a single moment of public hubris. His legacy, his family's name, was being immolated on the pyre of his ego. Then the phone rang. It was Robert Caldwell, the lead independent director of his board, a man Richard had played golf with for 20 years. Robert, Richard began, his voice a dry croak. It was a spectacle, I know, but we can manage the narrative. There is no narrative to manage, Richard. Robert's voice was like ice water. There was no familiarity, no friendship, only the cold calculus of corporate survival. The board convened an emergency teleconference an hour ago. We have lost all faith in your leadership. Your actions were not just embarrassing, they were a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. You publicly attacked the very individual who held the key to our company's future, a fact you were clearly unaware of. It demonstrates a level of recklessness that is indefensible. Robert, you can't. This is not a discussion. It's a notification. Caldwell cut him off coldly. There will be a formal meeting at 4 p.m. We expect your resignation. If you refuse, the board is unanimous in its decision to terminate for cause. Your security credentials for the building have already been revoked. A courier will deliver the relevant documents this morning. The line went dead. He was locked out, a prisoner in his own penthouse. He stared at the phone in his hand, this sleek, black obelisk that connected him to the world, and felt an overwhelming urge to destroy it. With a roar of pure, impotent rage, he hurled it against a wall of Italian marble, where it shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. The silence that returned was absolute, the silence of a tomb. Across the city, in an apartment overlooking the Flatiron district, Catherine Davenport's morning was the mirror opposite. She had been awake since 5, not reveling in victory, but immersed in the complex schematics of Oratech's server architecture. Her world hadn't stopped for celebration. It had accelerated. Her own phone was buzzing incessantly, but for entirely different reasons. Her investors from Silicon Valley called their voices giddy with excitement. The board of Nexus Solutions called, offering effusive congratulations. Her company's stock, on the cusp of its own public offering, was now one of the most anticipated IPOs in a decade. Her response to each caller was the same gracious calm and relentlessly forward-looking. "Thank you, Mark, I appreciate it," she said to a prominent venture capitalist. "But the real work starts now. I'm looking at the integration plan for the Cambridge team. I'd like to schedule a call to discuss revised Q3 projections." Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Sarah, stood in the doorway of her home office, looking overwhelmed. "The media requests are insane," Sarah said. "Every major network wants an exclusive. Time wants to put you on the cover. Olivia Munro has called 5 times. Catherine looked up from her screen, her expression thoughtful. "Decline them all for now, Sarah. Please issue a single statement. Say that my priority is the well-being and integration of the employees of both Nexus Solutions and Oratech. This isn't about me. It's about the powerful future we are all going to build together." Her focus was a shield. By refusing to engage with the personal drama, she elevated the entire narrative. This wasn't a soap opera. It was a paradigm shift, and she was its architect. Later that morning, Henry Wallace found her, not in her executive suite, but in a glass-walled conference room, a whiteboard marker in her hand, deep in a technical debate with her 2 lead engineers. The office around them was buzzing with a joyful electric energy. Henry waited patiently, holding 2 cups of coffee. When she finally took a break, he handed one to her, along with a copy of the Wall Street Journal. The story was above the fold. "They're calling you the Quiet Titan," he said, his eyes twinkling. "A much better moniker than the one in the Post. They're calling you the Matriarch of Vengeance." Catherine glanced at the headline and frowned. "Vengeance is a fire that consumes the person who wields it, Henry. It's an emotional indulgence. This was never that. It was a strategic acquisition of a critical asset that an opponent foolishly undervalued and publicly insulted. The personal history simply provided the context." "The world doesn't see it that way." Henry smiled. "My phone has been ringing off the hook. A dozen of Richard's old rivals want to send you cases of champagne to celebrate his demise. Tell them to send their donations to the MIT Scholarship Fund instead," she said without hesitation. "We don't celebrate another's ruin, Henry. We celebrate our own success. There is a fundamental difference." She walked to the window looking out over the city. She could see the top of the Beaumont Industries Tower in the distance, a monument to a fading era. She felt no thrill, no surge of victorious adrenaline. She felt a quiet finality. Richard's greatest mistake, she realized, was not just his arrogance, but his inability to see beyond the personal. To him, business was a conquest, a war of egos. For her, it had become an act of creation. "There are two balance sheets in life," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The one you show your investors with profits and losses written in black and red ink. And then there's the unwritten one, the one that measures value and worth." Richard's unwritten balance sheet was now catastrophically in the red, his assets of pride and power revealed as toxic liabilities. Her own, she knew, was just beginning to show its true value. And it had nothing to do with Richard Beaumont's failure, and everything to do with her own hard-won success. Her victory wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of hers. 3 months after the Metropolitan Innovators Gala, the name Catherine Davenport had become synonymous with a new kind of power. She was on the cover of Forbes magazine, not in a gown, but in a hard hat at a Nexus Aura construction site. The headline, bold and unequivocal, "The Disruptor." How Catherine Davenport built a clean energy empire and rewrote the rules. The story of the gala had become a modern business legend, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms about the dangers of hubris. For Catherine, however, the legend was a distraction. The real work was in the day-to-day grind of merging two distinct corporate cultures. Auratech's Cambridge-based academics and Nexus Solutions' scrappy New York engineers were a potent but volatile mix. Her days were a marathon of integration meetings, logistical analyses, and strategic planning sessions. She thrived on it. The complexities of building the company left little room for dwelling on the past. Richard Beaumont had been relegated to a closed file, a historical data point in her own stunning rise. The company Richard had left behind, Beaumont Industries, was in its death throes. Picked apart by activist investors and crushed by debt, it was being sold for scrap. Divisions were being shuttered or auctioned off to the highest bidder. It was a predictable end, and Catherine paid it little mind. Then the message came. It wasn't an email or a call, but a formal letter delivered by courier, written on the letterhead of a law firm she didn't recognize. It was from the trustee, managing the liquidation of Richard Beaumont's personal assets. The letter was circumspect, stating that Mr. Beaumont requested a brief private meeting to discuss a matter of profound personal and ethical importance. She tossed the letter onto her desk, annoyed at the intrusion. Her first instinct was to ignore it. What could they possibly have to discuss? That evening, she mentioned it to Henry during their weekly dinner. "He wants a meeting," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. Henry Wallace put down his fork, his expression hardening. "Don't do it, Catherine. There is absolutely nothing to be gained. You won. The story is over. Let him fade away. Any meeting will be a trap, a plea for money, a pathetic attempt at absolution, or worse, an effort to drag you back into his toxic orbit." "I know," Catherine said, staring into the candle's flame. "Logically, you're right. So you're going to ignore it." She was silent for a long moment. "I don't think I can," she admitted more to herself than to him. "It feels unfinished. Not for him, for me. I need to close the file myself, not just let it gather dust." Henry sighed, recognizing the same quiet determination that had convinced him to fund her impossible idea years ago. "If you must," he conceded, "then you control everything. The time, the place, the terms. No audience, no witnesses. And you walk away the second it serves no purpose." Catherine chose the Blue Bar at the Algonquin Hotel for the meeting. It was a place steeped in history, but quiet and discreet on a weekday afternoon. It was neutral ground belonging to neither her world nor the one she had shared with Richard. She arrived first, choosing a small secluded table in a dark corner. She ordered a sparkling water and waited, feeling a strange calm, the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a final, predictable chemical reaction. He was 10 minutes late. When he walked in, she almost didn't recognize him. The Richard Beaumont who approached her table was a ghost of the man who had pointed at her and laughed. The bespoke suits and confident swagger were gone. He wore a simple, slightly ill-fitting blazer and slacks. His face was gaunt, the skin sallow, and his eyes, once alight with arrogance, were hollowed out and haunted. He looked 20 years older. The Titan had become a spectre. "Catherine," he said, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. He gestured awkwardly to the chair opposite her. "Thank you for coming." She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "You said this was a matter of importance." A waiter approached, and Richard flinched, almost startled by the attention. He ordered a coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "I'm not here to ask for anything for myself," he began, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. "I know what I did, what I said, the cruelty of it. I see it now. I was a fool, blinded by pride. I deserve everything that's happened to me." And Catherine remained silent, offering no comfort, no absolution. This was his confession, not a negotiation. "But it's not about me," he continued, finally looking up. His eyes were filled with a raw, desperate plea she had never seen before. "It's about the company. Not my company anymore, I know that. But the original Beaumont Industrial Works. The one my grandfather started in a garage in Pittsburgh. It's about the people." He explained that while the oil and gas divisions were being sold off to competitors, one part of the company was about to be obliterated entirely, the Advanced Materials and Renewables division. It was a small, underfunded R&D unit that his own father had started, a passion project that Richard had always dismissed as a waste of resources. They had been working on next-generation battery technology and lightweight composite materials for wind turbines. "The liquidators are just going to shut it down," he said, his voice cracking. "Fire everyone. Sell the patents for pennies on the dollar to some overseas conglomerate. There are 250 employees in that division, Catherine. Brilliant scientists, engineers. People who have been with the company for decades. Their work is important. It was the one part of the company that was actually trying to build something for the future, and I ignored it." Catherine felt a sudden, sharp jolt of interest that cut through her detachment. She knew of the division. Her own team had tried to recruit some of their talent, but the engineers were famously loyal to the Beaumont legacy, if not to Richard himself. "I'm asking you to look at it," he pleaded, leaning forward. "Nexus Aura is the only company that would understand what they're doing. You could buy it, not as a favor to me. God, no. But because it's valuable. Because their work complements yours. You could save it, save their research, save their jobs. Let my family's name mean something more than just my failure." Here it was, the ultimate irony. The man who had defined her as a mere decorator was now begging her to recognize the value in a part of his own empire that he himself had been too blind to see. He wasn't asking for a handout. He was presenting her with a business opportunity, the last and only valuable card he had left to play. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see the monster who had tried to destroy her. She saw a broken man trying to salvage a single piece of honor from the wreckage of his life. "I will have my team conduct their due diligence," she said, her voice cool and professional. "If the assets are viable and the price is fair, we will consider making an offer to the trustees." Relief washed over Richard's face so profoundly that he seemed to deflate. Tears welled in his eyes, and he quickly looked away, embarrassed. "Thank you," he whispered. "That's all I can ask." He stood to leave, a man with nothing left to say. As he turned, he paused. "For what it's worth, Catherine," he said, not looking at her. "I'm sorry. For everything." He walked away without waiting for a response, disappearing into the city's afternoon crowds. Catherine sat for a long time, the ice in her water melting completely. Henry had been wrong. The meeting had not been a trap. It had been something far more complex, a reckoning. The due diligence was swift and aggressive. Catherine's team discovered that the Beaumont Renewables division was, as Richard had claimed, a hidden gem. Their battery chemistry patents were potentially revolutionary years ahead of the market. Richard, in his obsession with fossil fuels, had been sitting on a gold mine and hadn't even known it. 2 weeks later, the board of Nexus Aura unanimously approved the acquisition. The press release was simple and strategic, highlighting the synergy and the value of the patents. It mentioned in passing that the move would save over 200 jobs in Pittsburgh. There was no mention of Richard Beaumont. On the day the deal closed, Catherine was working late. The city lights twinkled outside her panoramic window. Her office was quiet, the hum of the servers, a comforting reminder of the machine she had built. Her gaze fell upon the painting of the windswept coastline, the one she had bought in a life before Richard, a symbol of a freedom she had once known and had now reclaimed on a scale she could never have imagined. She thought of Richard's apology. She felt no need to accept it or reject it. It was his burden, not hers. Her actions acquiring the division, saving the jobs, harnessing the technology, were not about him. They were not about forgiveness or revenge. They were the logical, strategic, and ultimately the right moves for her company, for the future she was building. She had won the war at the gala. But in the quiet of this hotel bar and the sterile language of an acquisition agreement, she had won the peace. She had proven that true power wasn't the ability to crush your enemies. It was the ability to build an empire so strong, so visionary, and so fundamentally sound that it could absorb the best parts of your enemy's legacy and make them your own, all while leaving the broken man behind. Her balance sheet wasn't just profitable, it was for the first time whole. And so Catherine Davenport's ascent was complete, not with a bitter laugh, but with the quiet hum of a well-earned empire. This wasn't just a story of revenge, it was a powerful testament to resilience, intelligence, and the incredible strength of a person who refuses to be defined by how others see them. Richard Beaumont didn't lose because he was outplayed in business. He lost because he fundamentally misunderstood the value of the person he threw away. Catherine's story reminds us that the ultimate power lies not in tearing someone else down, but in building yourself up far beyond their reach. What did you think of Catherine's epic comeback? Do you believe Richard got what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this incredible story of triumph, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a dose of inspiration, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life dramas that will leave you breathless.